Okay, let's bring up the Screen Rant article. We'll take a look at this here first because you bring it up here. So it says here, James Gunn talked to Marvel about a Guardians of the Galaxy Suicide Squad crossover. So I mean, just so we're clear on that at this moment in time, um, you know, uh, you know, so the thing is like, it's his properties. That's what you have to remember here, right? Is that it's his properties. So, the movies he's working on. Now, James Gunn says he spoke to Marvel and DC Comics executives about making a potential crossover film between the Guardians and the Suicide Squad. Now, apparently, both companies jointly published DC versus Marvel and JLA Avengers comics in 96 and in 2003. Both of these issues featured iconic crossover moments, such as Darkseid wielding the Infinity Gauntlet and Wonder Woman lifting Thor's hammer. In addition to these comics, Marvel and DC also publish a crossover of Spider-Man and Spider-Man under the appropriately named, or Superman and Spider-Man under the title Superman versus the Amazing Spider-Man in March of 1976. Is that even a fight? Their powers aren't even comparable. They're just not even comparable in my mind. Anyway, so, in response to a fan on Twitter, Gunn revealed that he did in fact talk to Marvel and DC about doing a Guardians of the Galaxy and Suicide crossover, though Gunn mentions that he just casually talked to the powers that be about the crossover. He goes on to say that while it's very unlikely to actually happen, it isn't exactly an impossibility either. Gunn also followed up his tweet by stating he prefers a strong story rather than seeing constant crossovers and mashups. So the idea here, so he was asked, do you think that there's a remote chance we'll see a big blockbuster crossover in the MCU and DC? And he says, I've casually talked to the powers that be at both Marvel and DC about it. I would love for it to happen. I don't think that it's likely, but I don't think it's an impossibility either. That said, just constantly seeing crossovers and mashups is less enchanting to me than a strong story. So, I mean, we have to talk about the context of how this particular discussion came to be. And I am merely speculating at this point. I am merely speculating. But I do believe that there is a through line here. So what we know is that 3 years ago, next month, is when James Gunn was fired off of Guardians of the Galaxy for those tweets. He was almost immediately contacted by DC, which I think many of us kind of figured that was going to happen, right? Many of us out there kind of figured that Gunn was going to be talked to by DC. It just seemed to make the most amount of sense. Like when you've got this massively popular, albeit controversial filmmaker that is now released from his contract with the House of Mouse, you move in and you swoop him up. That's just what you do. That's business. But at the same time, he chose to do Suicide Squad because remember, they offered him Superman. They offered him kind of whatever he wanted, but he wanted to do Suicide Squad and he wanted to do it his way. So later on that year, when they announced that he would be coming back to Marvel and, Marvel, and he had said, I think in recent months that Marvel was unaware about the DC connection right away, which I don't necessarily fully believe. I think Feige was fully informed of it, but there was not much Feige or even Iger could do because their hands were tied because of you could say kind of the public backlash at the time, but the amount of support that he got from his friends definitely aided in his return. But it was most likely during the time when Marvel and DC were trying to figure out the shooting schedules, because I have a feeling that was a big topic of conversation. Because when was James Gunn going to go do a Suicide Squad? And when was James Gunn going to go do Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3? That is something that they definitely had conversations over because of scheduling, because these are massive hundreds of millions of dollars in budgets and marketing and merchandise and everything that goes into making these movies. So it just seems to make the most amount of sense that at this point in time, James Gunn would in fact have to have communicated with both Marvel and DC in order to come to a copacetic agreement about scheduling. So it could be during this time, and this is what if I had to think about it, is probably this time. During this time is when James Gunn most likely, probably jokingly, made the comment about doing a Guardians of the Galaxy and Suicide Squad crossover. Because When people are framing it from the perspective of saying, oh, doing a DC and Marvel team up movie or having a crossover film, what do people mostly think of? That it would be Avengers and Justice League. That's what people think. But in reality, this was a James Gunn created property and the upcoming James Gunn directed movie. So it just makes the most amount of sense that James Gunn at this point in time would probably just go, yeah, why don't we, like, jokingly, well, what if we just did a crossover at somewhere down the road? You know, as a way to kind of maybe smooth the tensions and open up the thing that he's willing to work with both companies, because that's really what it boils down to. James Gunn is top tier AAA talent. He is a, you know, he's proven himself in the comic book movie space. You may or may not like his sense of humor or the degeneracy of the jokes that he made. I make a lot of terrible jokes, so I understand like where he was coming from with a lot of that stuff. Again, I've said very horrible things that are indefensible and stupid. But that was also indicative of the time and not who I am today. Very similar with James Gunn. So he probably made the comment simply as a way to just smooth over any kind of rough waters in the conversation and to show that he is a company player, that he is in it for the long haul, that he just wants to tell stories and he's willing to work with everybody, which again is the most simplest explanation for this piece of information that's going around. Now, if James Gunn ever sees this or ever hears about this and ever comes out and clarifies everything else, then I would love to be wrong and to know more information. But the way that he kind of framed it in that tweet was, it was just like, it was an offhand comment. It clearly went nowhere. However, him saying that it's not likely, but it could be, but it's not an impossibility. What does that mean? Right? What does that mean? So here's the reason why that's fascinating, because that gives you an idea of the state of affairs at DC, not Marvel. At DC, Marvel is fine. They're kind of killing it right now. Loki is amazing. It's such a good show. But DC is faltering and they're flailing. I mean, we're not talking about the fact that the Flash is shooting or was it Black Adam is filming. We're not talking about like the Batman right away. What we're talking about this week is about whether or not Batman eats pussy, about whether or not Batman wants to bring his female partner to orgasm, and the fact that the female orgasm is not a myth. That is what we're talking about in regards to DC. Oral sex. With Marvel, it's like, hey guys, did you happen to see the birth of the multiverse that happened on June 16th, 6/16? Do you get the inside joke there? Because that's how far ahead Marvel thinks on this shit. Totally different state of affairs within the company. So basically, it's like, look, if Marvel is ever in a situation where they need something kind of massive or really kind of campy, that might be why it's on the table. We know that DC is like heavily trying to push the multiverse for financial reasons. Marvel's doing it for story-based reasons. And so maybe that might be something down the road if Marvel is running out of ideas creatively. And they're like, look, we need something to kind of inject some new blood into this. We've done it before. Why don't we do an Elseworld story or a one-off tale? Avengers meets Justice League. We're cool. That is probably the only likely scenario of something like this actually taking place. In the meantime, it was just mostly an offhand conversation, but one that James did open up with pretty well. And he's open about it with the audience, which is something that I really love. So anyway, I do want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I want to hear what you guys have to say about this, because it is very fascinating to have this thing kind of come out there in a way that's pretty funny. And it's pretty interesting. And it's also kind of hog wild that it's been discussed on any kind of like, not even official, but just like even superficial level. But it also might show you again that the state of affairs with the comic book movies are maybe not as good. And maybe that foundation isn't as good as previously thought, which is to me the most fascinating part of it. So again, totally let me know your thoughts on this one. I am curious to know.